into ophthalmology?
Well, I've been practicing for about 30 years, and I've always worked with ophthalmology. I'm an optometrist, and then I needed ophthalmology to do my med-surg cases. And then 21 years ago, I sold my practice to this ophthalmology group that I worked with for a number of years on a referral relationship, and then been with them since then, and I am now Senior Vice President, Southwestern Eye Center. I supervise our doctors, of which we have 40.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is a lot.
So, how does LASIK work?
LASIK works by changing the curvature of the cornea on the front of the lens, on the front of the eye. The cornea there's two lens systems in the eye. There's the cornea, which is the clear part in the front, like where you put a contact on, or then there's the crystalline lens on the inside of the eye. And by changing the curvature on the cornea, you change the refractive power of the eye. And that's what you do with LASIK.
Surgeons can correct this by using a laser to reshape the curvature of the front surface of the eye, called the cornea. The surgeon operates on one eye at a time. He cleans the eye, the lid, and the lashes with antiseptic, and administers anesthetic drops to freeze the eye and lid. He opens the lid wide with a speculum, then rinses the eye with a saline solution. Everything's frozen so the patient doesn't feel a thing. Next, antibiotic drops to prevent infection. Before every operation, the surgeon tests the equipment. He fires the laser on a metal plate to test its energy level. The surgeon administers a few more anesthetic drops, then inspects the microkeratome, the device used to lift a very thin layer from the outer surface of the eye. He also measures the patient's cornea using an ultrasonic instrument. The cornea must be a minimum thickness for it to be safely reshaped. The surgeon uses the speculum again to prop the lid open. Then he begins the operation. He marks the eye with sterile ink, reference marks he'll use later. Next, he positions a metal ring around the cornea. The ring is attached to a suction pump, so it clings to the eye. Like holding a tomato steady while you slice it, it holds the eye steady while the surgeon cuts the tissue. The surgeon lubricates the eye with sterile water, then mops up the excess water with a small absorbent sponge. Then he takes the microkeratome and slips it into the grooves in the metal suction ring. In a matter of seconds, the device moves across the eye, cutting open a flap of tissue, the same way a carpenter's plane shaves a layer of wood. The surgeon uses a sterile sponge ring to keep tears from contaminating the cornea. He folds back the flap of tissue, exposing the cornea. He mops up the excess liquid, then starts up the laser. Meanwhile, a tiny sponge keeps the flap moist. The laser, an invisible light, fires in pulses 50 pulses per second. Each pulse vaporizes an area of corneal tissue 100,000ths of an inch thick. The laser has been computer programmed beforehand, so it knows exactly how to reshape the cornea to give most patients 20/20 vision. In less than a minute, it's done. The surgeon removes the sponge, and then, using those little ink marks he made earlier as reference points, folds the flap back to its original position. If the flap isn't precisely where it was before, the patient will have distorted vision. Using a syringe that flushes the area with sterile water, the surgeon carefully smooths the flap, the same way you'd smooth out a tablecloth. Then he removes the sponge ring. Within 45 seconds, the negative pressure inside the cornea sucks the flap back on. The flap literally seals itself. With the sponge, the surgeon dabs up any excess water. He applies antibiotic drops as a preventive measure. Then inspects the microkeratome again before moving on to the other eye. He takes the speculum off, tapes the eye closed, then performs the same operation on the other eye. When that's done, the surgeon uses a high-powered microscope to make sure the flaps are wrinkle-free. The patient wears protection shields until the next morning, then overnight for a week.
Some are the hazards of practicing LASIK?
Well, you have to, with LASIK, in order for the refractive effect to be permanent, you have to get down into the stroma, or the inner layers of the cornea. And getting down to that is one of the hard parts. You either have to make a flap, you got a flap across the front of the cornea, a little microscopically thin flap. You lift that up, and then you do the LASIK, then you put the flap back down. Or we use a femtosecond laser, which cuts the flap for you, and it's even thinner. One of the big hazards is if you don't get everything perfectly aligned, then you create irregular powers on the front of the eye.
Laser LASIK or bladeless LASIK, and how it's different?
Yes, the flap is cut with a microkeratome. That's a mechanical procedure where it actually sucks onto the eye, and then a motorized superfine flap is cut. When you do the bladeless one with all laser, then a laser actually cuts the flap on the front of the eye. And you have to get down into the deeper layer, so you have to get through that flap. There's another procedure where you soften the cornea and you denude the outer layer of the epithelium. But in that case, when the healing occurs, when the anesthesia wears off, those patients are hurting, and they have very uncomfortable, very light sensitive eyes for about 48 hours.
Which would you say is more effective, bladeless or traditional LASIK?
That's a tough one. I think that the new laser, the new femtosecond lasers are more effective. They're not faster, and they're not 100%. I'd say a lot of it depends on the hands of the surgeon that's doing the procedure and how comfortable they are. I think the new femtosecond lasers, which are more automatic, are safer that way. Although with a really good surgeon who's very competent, has a very good microkeratome, I think that they're definitely faster and you get results really quick. With both procedures, there's always the risk of infection afterwards. There's always the risk of some inflammation that gets underneath the flap. And so that's always a concern.
Do you say makes an optimal candidate?
An optimal candidate, I would say, be a person who's moderately nearsighted, measuring in diopter units. It would be somebody's around -2, -3, -4. They're great. And they don't see well without their glasses or contacts. They really appreciate the value. Their powers aren't so strong that you can't fully correct it. They don't have a lot of astigmatism. And then there's the psychological factors as well. You know, it's a little unnerving to know that the front of your eye is going to be cut and then lasered and then the flap put back down. You have to have some, we give the patient some sedation just before surgery. But those patients who are desirous, patients who appreciate it, those are the best candidates. And they're not too scared about having it done.
So why do you think that LASIK has become so sought after?
Because the effects are great. People people who could not see well at all without their glasses or contacts before can now see very, very good. Excellent. Many times 20/20 or 20/20 plus vision right after surgery. I see a lot of one-day post-op LASIKs, and it's not uncommon to have patients, start crying, which makes their eyes burn into tears because they can see so good as soon as they get their patches off. They just see amazingly good.
So what would you say the percentage of patients is who retain 20/20 sight or better?
20/25 or better, I would say is about right around 90%.
Oh wow, that's a good percentage.
It is. You have to. If you have the right candidates going in, if you get the right procedure, the right laser, then they do very well. Now, your powers naturally shift over time, and this corrects your vision at that moment when you do the laser. 10 years later, if your powers are normally going to change, they're still going to change, and you may need to have an enhancement or a touch-up. In some cases, patients will wear glasses when they night drive or something, whereas before they were 100% dependent on it. But 10 years down the road, they may need to use them to night drive. It may be not enough that you want to do an enhancement, but yet they're not as sharp as they were right after surgery. Sure.
But if you don't have an answer, that's okay. Do you think that LASIK surgery is a good example of modern physics in today's world?
I think is an excellent example of modern physics. I think LASIK today is great. So a lot of smart physicians that figured this out, and smart physicists that work with those physicians that got this procedure down. It's an outstanding example. Lasers, curvature, even the system that's used, the tracking system on the laser. Some people think if they move their eye at all, it'll throw the calculations off, but the laser locks on the eye. The feedback on that system is 10 times a second, so you can control really micro blinks. You don't have to lock the eye where it can't move. So.
In medicine.
So what's being done right now in the next 2 to 5 years to improve cataract surgery procedures, also lower the costs?
Well, it's interesting because cataract surgery right now is being performed manually. So you actually are doing
with a little needle.
With a little needle, and it's all freehand. But the future will be doing it by laser, and that's actually
like they do with LASIK.
Just like LASIK. In fact, one of the lasers that's now being used in LASIK is known as a femtosecond laser. Femto means 10 to the minus 15. Very, very short pulses. You can make extremely fine cuts. More accurate than anybody in their wildest dreams could have believed in the past. And so now you can make very precise cuts, not only in the cornea, which we're now doing in LASIK, but you can also make very, very good cuts in the lens itself, and you can actually chop up the lens. Something that in the past it's all been done manually. You can do sort of pre-chops and make the entire thing mushy, so to speak, and then just suck it out with the tube.
I love the technical term there, but the scientific vision. Three major companies are working on this right now, and they're competing to get to market, correct?
That's right. The biggest company in the entire world, ophthalmology company, is Alcon, and Alcon has just basically purchased a femtosecond laser cataract system called LensX, and there's another company called LensR, and then there's a company called Optomedica. There are 2 European companies, Femtolas and Visumax.